My name is Maya. I was 16 when this story began. I'm 24 now, sitting in the living room of a house on Elmwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio. A house that has my name on the deed. And I want to tell you everything. But first I need you to understand who I was in that family. Because my position in that household is the entire reason I saw what I saw, heard what I heard, and eventually understood what was actually happening before anyone else did. I was not the favorite grandchild. I was not the one who got praised at holiday dinners. I was not the one whose achievements got announced to relatives over the phone, whose photographs ended up framed on walls, whose opinions were solicited at the adult table. I was the quiet one, the background one, the kid who sat in corners at family gatherings and watched how the adults actually behaved when they thought no one worth worrying about was paying attention. And no one in that family ever thought I was worth worrying about. Which turned out to be the greatest advantage I ever had. My grandmother, Nanny we always called her, was built from a completely different material than the rest of us. She was small, 5 feet 2 inches on a good day. With white hair she kept pinned back and hands that were always slightly rough from gardening. But she filled every room she entered in a way I've never been able to fully explain. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to demand attention. People just oriented toward her, like she was a fixed point and everyone else was moving around her. She came to this country in 1971. She was 31 years old and she arrived with $40 in her purse, 2 suitcases, and a stubbornness I am absolutely convinced skipped a generation and landed directly in me. She didn't speak perfect English. She didn't have family here. She didn't have connections or advantages or anyone waiting to help her land softly. What she had was discipline, patience, and an ability to think 10 moves ahead that I didn't fully appreciate until I was old enough to look back and see the whole board. By 1974, 3 years after arriving in a country that was not her own, she had saved enough to put a down payment on a 3-bedroom brick colonial on Elmwood Drive. $2,400 down. She remembers the exact figure. She paid off the mortgage in 11 years. By herself. While raising children. While working. While building a life from scratch in a place that didn't always make that easy. She raised 5 children in that house. My mother was the youngest. By the time I was born, Nanny had been a widow for 6 years. Her husband, my grandfather, a man I only know from photographs and one specific story she told me when I was 9, had passed quietly in his sleep. She buried him, grieved him, and then got back up and continued running her household with the same quiet precision she'd always had. She didn't fall apart. She didn't need rescuing. She tended her rose garden, cooked Sunday dinners large enough to feed 12 people, kept her finances organized in a green accordion folder in the second drawer of her desk, and asked absolutely nothing from any of her children. She was, by every definition, a self-sufficient woman. But here is what I have learned about self-sufficient women, particularly older ones, particularly ones who keep to themselves and don't complain and don't make demands. They make certain people deeply uncomfortable, especially people who have quietly decided, without discussion and without any legal or moral basis, that her accumulated assets belong to them by right of proximity and patience. My parents had been in financial trouble for years before that night in the kitchen. My father had invested heavily in a logistics startup in 2014 that collapsed 18 months later. My mother had co-signed a business loan for her brother that went into default. They had credit card debt spread across 6 different accounts. I know the exact number because I found the consolidated statement 2 years later in a filing cabinet my father forgot to lock. The total outstanding balance, as of March 2019, was $91,400. They were drowning. Quietly, carefully, with smiles at family dinners and a kept-up house and the right clothes and the right car, but drowning. And they had decided, without telling anyone, without asking anyone, without any consultation with the woman whose entire life's work was at stake, that Nanny's house was their solution. The house on Elmwood Drive. Valued at $310,000 in the current market. paid off completely. No liens. No complications. At least that's what they thought. What happened with the house didn't arrive from nowhere. It was the final move in a long game. And if you want to understand how my parents could convince themselves that what they were doing was somehow acceptable, you need to understand the years that led up to it. Because this wasn't the first time they had tried to help themselves to something that belonged to my grandmother. It was just the biggest. The first time I noticed the pattern, I was 11 years old. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October. The kind of afternoon where the light comes in low and golden through the kitchen windows and everything feels deceptively peaceful. Nanny was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. My father sat across from her with a folder. He always came with folders, I'd learn, and he was explaining in his most reasonable and patient voice that he could help her grow her savings. He used words like portfolio diversification. He used words like inflation erosion and passive returns and market-linked instruments. He spoke for almost 20 minutes without stopping. I was doing homework at the far end of the table, and I remember watching Nanny's face the entire time. She listened. She nodded occasionally. She sipped her tea. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, simply and without any particular emotion, "Thank you, Beta. I prefer to manage my own affairs." My father smiled. He gathered his folder. He said of course, whatever she was comfortable with. And then we drove home and he didn't speak for the entire 40-minute ride. 3 months later. He tried again. This time he brought printed documents. She read every page. She signed nothing. I was 11 and I already understood that the folder wasn't really about helping her. The second incident happened when I was 13. Nanny's house needed a new roof. The original had finally started showing its age, and after the previous winter's ice damage, it couldn't wait another season. The estimate came in at $11,400. My parents offered generously and loudly at a family dinner to take care of it. They would hire the contractor. They would manage the project. Nanny wouldn't have to worry about a single thing. She thanked them. She let them handle it. What she didn't know, what none of us knew for almost 2 years, was that my parents had paid the roofing invoice using a credit card opened in her name, using her social security number, without her knowledge or consent. They made minimum payments for 22 months. By the time Nanny discovered the account during a routine call with her bank, the balance with interest had grown to $14,800. She paid it off in 3 payments. She closed the account. And she called a meeting with all 5 of her children in which she said, very calmly and without raising her voice, that she would be handling all of her own financial matters going forward and that no one was to act on her behalf without written permission. My parents apologized. They said it was a misunderstanding. They said they'd meant to tell her. They said it wouldn't happen again. It did happen again. Just differently. The third incident is the one that I return to most often, because it's the one where I became a witness without fully understanding what I was witnessing until much later. The summer I turned 15, Nanny was hospitalized for 3 days. A respiratory infection. Serious enough to be frightening, not serious enough to be life-threatening. She recovered completely. But while she was in the hospital, my mother drove to the house. I was in the car. She told me she needed to pick up Nanny's insurance documents and a change of clothes. Sounded reasonable. Sounded like the kind of thing a caring daughter would do. We arrived at the house at 11:20 in the morning. My mother used the spare key kept for genuine emergencies. She told me to wait in the car. I waited 7 minutes. Then I went inside. My mother was in Nanny's bedroom, standing at the desk in the corner, going through the second drawer, the one where Nanny kept the green accordion folder. She didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her photograph documents with her phone. Then I said her name and she startled and told me she'd asked me to wait in the car. We left 45 minutes after we arrived. My mother was carrying a folder. I didn't say anything on the drive back to the hospital. I was 15. I didn't know exactly what I'd seen. I just knew that something about it felt profoundly wrong. 2 weeks after Nanny came home from the hospital, I heard my parents talking through the wall again. Late at night. The words I caught were the deed, quitclaim, straightforward process. She won't understand the language. That was the moment I stopped being a passive observer. I started writing things down. Exact words when I could catch them. I didn't have a plan. I was 15 years old. I didn't know what a quitclaim deed was. I didn't know what an irrevocable trust was. I didn't fully understand what they were capable of. But I knew my grandmother. And I knew that whatever was being planned in that house, she deserved to know about it. What I didn't know yet was that she already did. It happened on a Sunday. It is almost poetic, isn't it? That the moment my parents chose to make their move was on a Sunday afternoon, in Nanny's own kitchen, at her own table, surrounded by the smell of her cooking and the sound of her television playing softly in the background. They chose a Sunday because Sundays were family days. Sundays were safe. Sundays were the day Nanny was most relaxed, most open, most herself. They chose a Sunday because they thought she would be least prepared. I was 17 by this point. It was March, one of those Ohio March days that can't decide if it's winter or spring, where the sky is the color of old dishwater and the ground is still half frozen. I remember driving to Nanny's house that afternoon and noticing that my parents were both unusually quiet in the car. My father kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel the entire 40 minutes. My mother had her phone face down in her lap. Neither of them turned on the radio. Noticed. Always noticed. But I still didn't know what was coming. Nanny met us at the door the way she always did, with food already on the stove and her hair pinned back and a calmness that made you feel, the moment you stepped inside, that whatever was wrong with the outside world simply didn't apply here. She hugged me. She smelled like rose water and cardamom. She told me I looked thin and needed to eat more. I sat at the kitchen table. She served tea. For the first 30 minutes, everything felt normal. My father talked about work. My mother asked about Nanny's neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who had been dealing with hip surgery. Nanny answered everything calmly, poured more tea, passed a plate of biscuits, and then my father set his cup down. He reached into the bag he'd brought, a regular canvas bag, the kind you take to a farmer's market, completely unremarkable, and he placed a folder on the table. I recognized the folder. I had seen folders like it my entire life. My father always brought folders when he wanted something. He cleared his throat. He looked at my mother. She gave him a small nod. And then he said, "Mama, we need to talk to you about the house." Nanny set her cup down slowly. She folded her hands on the table. She said nothing. She just looked at him with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. Not surprise, not fear, not confusion. Something closer to patience. The particular patience of someone who has been waiting a long time for a conversation to finally arrive. My father spoke for almost 20 minutes. He had clearly rehearsed it. He talked about the neighborhood, how the market had peaked, how property values in Columbus were at a historic high, how it was the smartest possible time to sell. He talked about Nanny's age, carefully, gently but unmistakably, about how a house this size was a lot for one person to maintain, about how the money from the sale could set her up in something smaller and newer and easier to manage. He talked about a buyer, a very serious buyer, Mama, someone who has already made a very strong offer, and he slid a paper across the table with a number on it. $298,000. I looked at that number and something in my stomach dropped. Because I had looked up the Zillow estimate on Nanny's house 3 weeks earlier. Out of instinct, out of the same quiet watchfulness I'd been practicing for years, and the estimate had been $318,000. The buyer my father had found was already $20,000 below market value. And then my mother spoke. Her voice was soft and careful, the voice she used when she wanted to sound kind. She said, "We've already been in contact with a realtor, Mama. We've handled all the preliminary paperwork. We just need your signature on a few documents and the process can move forward. We want to make this as easy as possible for you." They had already contacted a realtor. They had already prepared paperwork. They were presenting this not as a question but as an announcement. "Not would you like to sell your house, but we have already begun selling your house and we need you to sign." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. I was sitting at that table and I was 17 years old and my hands were flat on my thighs under the table and I was trying to decide whether to say something, whether to stand up, I didn't know. I felt the way you feel when you're watching something terrible happen in slow motion and you can see every frame but your body hasn't caught up yet. And then Nanny spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't look frightened or overwhelmed or confused. All the things my parents had clearly expected and prepared for. She looked at my father. She looked at my mother. And she said, in a voice so calm it was almost conversational, "Which realtor did you contact?" My father blinked. He gave a name, a firm on the east side of Columbus. Nanny nodded slowly. She said, "And what paperwork have you prepared?" My mother shifted in her seat. She said something about transfer documents, about streamlining the process. Nanny nodded again. Then she was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at her folded hands. She looked out the kitchen window at her rose garden, still dormant in the March cold, just the bare thorned canes visible above the frozen ground. Then she looked back at my parents and she said, "I would like you to leave my house now. Both of you. I need to make a phone call." My father started to say something. Nanny raised one hand, just slightly, just enough, and he stopped. We left. In the car on the way home, my parents argued in low, controlled voices about what had gone wrong, about whether they'd moved too fast, about whether they needed to get the paperwork filed before she could do anything to complicate the process. My father said they had maybe a window of 2 weeks before she talked to someone who would advise her against it. Neither of them looked at me once. Neither of them knew that I had already decided, somewhere between that kitchen table and the car door, that I was going to call Nanny myself the moment I got home. That I was going to tell her everything I had seen and heard over the past 2 years. That I was done being the quiet one in the corner. I called her that night at 9 p.m. She picked up on the second ring. And she said before I could even begin, "Maya, I've been waiting for you to call." She already knew. That was the first thing I understood when I heard her voice on the phone that night. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't shaken. She wasn't processing what had happened at the kitchen table that afternoon the way I was. Replaying it, dissecting it, trying to figure out what came next. She had been ready for it. Asked her how. I asked her how she had known what they were planning, how she had stayed so calm, what she had meant when she said she needed to make a phone call. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Come to the house tomorrow morning. Come alone. I want to show you something." I told my parents I had a study group. I drove to Elmwood Drive at 9 a.m. Nanny was already at the kitchen table when I arrived, dressed and alert, with 2 cups of tea poured and a folder in front of her. Not my father's folder. A different one. Older, thicker, held together with a rubber band and labeled in her careful handwriting. She slid it across the table to me. Opened it. The first document was dated September 14th, 6 months before that Sunday dinner. It was a legal instrument I had to read 3 times before I fully understood what I was looking at. An irrevocable trust agreement, drawn up by a law firm I'd never heard of, with offices on the west side of Columbus, 40 minutes from Elmwood Drive, well outside the neighborhood where anyone who knew our family might notice her coming and going. I read the key clause twice, then a third time. The property located at 4117 Elmwood Drive, Columbus, Ohio, the house, the land, the structure, everything, had been transferred into an irrevocable family trust. The trust named Nanny as the lifetime beneficiary, meaning she retained the legal right to live in the house for the remainder of her life. And when the trust eventually dissolved, the property would transfer, automatically, legally, without any further action required, to the named remainder beneficiaries. My name was first on the list. My cousins Priya and Arjun were second and third. My parents' names appeared nowhere in the document. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time without saying anything. I turned the pages slowly. There was a cover letter from the attorney, a woman named Catherine Marsh, who had been practicing estate law in Columbus for 22 years. There was a recorded deed from the Franklin County Recorder's Office confirming the transfer. There was a letter from the trust company confirming its administration. Every document was stamped, notarized, filed, and legally airtight. The house had not belonged to my parents to sell. It had not belonged to my parents in any capacity for 6 full months. They had spent weeks contacting realtors, preparing transfer paperwork, and lining up a buyer for a property they had absolutely no legal claim to. I looked up at Nanny. She was watching me read with that expression she sometimes got, calm and patient and faintly, privately amused, like someone watching a film she'd already seen. I said, "When did you decide to do this?" She wrapped both hands around her teacup. She thought for a moment. "The summer you were 15, she said. "After I came home from the hospital. The summer I was 15. The afternoon my mother had spent 45 minutes in this house with a spare key and a phone camera. Nanny had come home, gone to her desk, opened the second drawer, and known immediately that someone had been through it. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't confronted anyone. She had simply picked up the phone and called Catherine Marsh. I asked her why she hadn't told anyone. Why she hadn't warned me or my cousins or any of the other adults in the family. She looked at me steadily. "Because the fewer people who knew," she said, "the cleaner it would stay. And because I needed to see how far they would actually go." She had wanted proof. Not suspicion, proof. The Sunday dinner had given her exactly that. My parents had sat at her table in her kitchen and told her they had already contacted a realtor and prepared paperwork for a property they had no right to touch. They had said it out loud, in front of a witness. That witness was me. She asked me then if I would be willing to write down everything I had seen and heard over the past 2 years. The late-night conversations. My mother at the desk. The folder she'd carried out of the house. The arguments through the wall. The exact words from the kitchen at 2:17 a.m. Every date and detail I'd recorded in the notes on my phone. I said yes before she finished asking. She nodded. She refilled my tea. And then she said, "Good. Now I need to call Catherine." Catherine Marsh had an office on Trobway Road. A low brick building with frosted glass doors and a small parking lot that was almost always half empty. I drove Nanny there 4 days after the Sunday dinner. I sat in the waiting room on a gray upholstered chair and read the same magazine page approximately 11 times while they met behind a closed door for just over an hour. When Nanny came out, she was carrying a new folder. She didn't tell me everything that was discussed in that meeting. She told me what I needed to know, which was, the trust was airtight, the property transfer was fully recorded and legally unassailable, and my parents' realtor had been operating on fraudulent instructions. Catherine had already placed a call to the real estate firm. That call, I would later learn, lasted 6 minutes. By the end of it, the listing, which my parents had apparently already submitted without Nanny's knowledge or signature, using documents I can only assume were either forged or obtained through some other means I don't want to speculate about in detail, had been pulled. The agent had been informed, in the careful language that estate attorneys use when they want to make a point without making a threat, that the property in question was held in an irrevocable trust, and that any further action taken without the trustee's written consent would constitute participation in fraudulent conveyance. The listing came down within the hour. But that was only the first move. Because the problem wasn't just the house. The problem was a pattern. 2 years of documented financial interference, a credit card opened fraudulently in Nanny's name, documents photographed without consent, and now an attempt to sell a property they had no legal claim to. Catherine had advised Nanny that if she wanted to, she had grounds to pursue this significantly further. Nanny chose not to go to the police. I want to be clear about that. It was her choice, made deliberately, and I respected it even when part of me didn't fully understand it. She said that she had not protected herself all these years by being impulsive. She had protected herself by being precise. And what she wanted was not punishment. What she wanted was finality. So instead of a police report, Catherine sent a letter. It went to my parents by certified mail, return receipt requested, on a Tuesday morning, 12 days after the Sunday dinner. I know the exact day because Nanny called me when she got the delivery confirmation. Her voice on the phone was completely level. I only saw the letter much later, when Nanny showed it to me herself. It was 4 pages long, written in the formal, technically precise language of estate law, and it outlined the following. The property at 4117 Elmwood Drive was held in an irrevocable trust, recorded with the Franklin County Recorder on September 14, and was not subject to sale, transfer, or encumbrance by any party other than the trustee. Any attempt to represent the property as available for sale, to solicit offers, to prepare or submit transfer documents, or to act as an agent for the property without written trustee authorization constituted fraudulent misrepresentation under Ohio law. The letter further noted that a credit account had been opened in the trust grantor's name without her knowledge or consent, that documents belonging to the trust grantor had been accessed and photographed without authorization, and that these incidents had been documented by a named witness, me, whose written account was attached as an exhibit. It then stated very clearly that no further legal action was being pursued at this time, that the trust grantor had elected not to involve law enforcement, that this letter was being provided as formal notice of the legal position of all parties. And it concluded with a single paragraph that I have read so many times I have it memorized. Our client wishes to make clear that she is fully aware of all actions taken regarding her property and her financial accounts over the past several years, that she has documented these actions comprehensively, and that she retains the right to pursue all available legal remedies should any further interference occur. She asks only that her remaining years in her home be spent in peace. My parents received that letter on a Tuesday. My father called Nanny that evening. She let it go to voicemail. He called again on Wednesday. She let that one go too. On Thursday he drove to the house and rang the doorbell for 4 minutes. Nanny watched from the upstairs window until he left. She called me afterward and told me what had happened. She sounded, if anything, slightly entertained. The buyer, whoever my parents had lined up, withdrew within the week. I don't know exactly what my parents told him, or whether Catherine had made any additional calls, or whether the buyer simply did his own due diligence and discovered the trust recording. It doesn't matter. He was gone. The realtor filed an internal complaint against my parents for submitting a listing without verified ownership documentation. I don't know the full details of what came from that. That particular thread isn't mine to pull, but I know that my parents' relationship with that firm ended permanently. And then came the legal fees. Because here's the thing about fraudulent conveyance and unauthorized account access and document misappropriation. Even when the injured party chooses not to press charges, there are still legal costs involved in documenting, responding to, and formally resolving the situation. Catherine's firm billed for the trust preparation, the title search, the cease communication letters, the certified mailings, the exhibit preparation, and the formal response to the realtor's inquiry. My parents received a portion of those costs as a civil recovery demand. The total was $14,200. They paid it over 8 months. During those 8 months, not a single member of my immediate family set foot inside the house on Elmwood Drive. Nanny's other children, the aunts and uncles who had been peripheral to all of this, who had watched from a distance and said nothing, called her with various degrees of apology and explanation and justification. She listened to each of them. She thanked them for calling. She changed the locks in April. And she planted new roses in the front garden in May. A variety she'd been wanting to try for years, a deep burgundy climber that she trained along the fence post by the front gate. She sent me a photograph the morning she planted them. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the collapse of a long deception. It is not the silence of resolution or peace. Not yet. It is the silence of aftermath. The silence of a house where certain phone calls no longer come, where certain cars no longer pull into the driveway, where the space that was once occupied by manipulation and performance and carefully maintained pretense has simply emptied out. That was the silence that settled over Elmwood Drive in the months that followed. My parents did not attend the next 3 family gatherings. The aunts and uncles who called Nanny with their careful apologies received polite, brief responses and were not invited to Sunday dinner. The family WhatsApp group, which had existed for 4 years and contained approximately 11,000 messages of photographs and forwarded jokes and birthday wishes, went completely quiet for 6 weeks, and then my father left it, and then my mother, and eventually it dissolved entirely without anyone formally acknowledging that it had ended. The buyer withdrew his offer within 8 days of the listing being pulled. I don't know exactly what he was told. I suspect he did his own title search and discovered the trust recording independently. Any competent buyer's agent would have caught it immediately. What I know is that he never contacted anyone in our family again, and the deal died without drama. The real estate firm's internal complaint process moved slowly, the way institutional processes always do, but it moved. My parents had submitted a property listing without verified ownership documentation, a serious professional violation. The agent who had worked with them, apparently having conducted minimal due diligence of his own, faced his own review. I don't know the precise outcome of that process. What I know is that my parents were permanently blacklisted from that firm and that the agent no longer works there. The civil recovery demand, $14,200, covering Catherine's documented legal costs, arrived by certified mail in April. My parents' first response was to not respond, which Catherine anticipated and which resulted in a follow-up letter that used somewhat more direct language about the available next steps. They paid the first installment in May. They finished paying in January of the following year. I know these details because Nanny told me. She told me everything eventually in the careful and measured way she did everything. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces over time, usually over tea at the kitchen table, usually in the morning when the light came in through the east window and fell across the table in long golden rectangles. She never spoke about it with anger. She never expressed satisfaction in the way that people sometimes expect. The sharp, bright satisfaction of watching someone get exactly what they deserved. She spoke about it the way she spoke about everything that had already been resolved. As history. Factual. Complete. Filed away. My parents eventually reached out to me directly. First my mother by text 3 months after the letter, and then my father by phone 5 months after that. The conversations were uncomfortable and circular, and ended without resolution. They wanted, I think, for me to tell them that I understood, that I saw their side of it, that the financial pressure they'd been under explained if not excused what they'd done. I didn't tell them that. I wasn't cruel about it. But I didn't give them what they were looking for. What I told my father, the one time he asked me directly why I had given Nanny my written account of everything I'd witnessed, was this. Because she asked me to. And because it was true. He didn't have an answer for that. My parents are still married. They are still in Columbus. They have managed, over the years since, to stabilize their finances through means that don't involve taking things that belong to other people. We have a relationship. Careful, bounded, conducted mostly at a distance. I am cordial. I am not close. I have made my peace with the version of them that I actually have rather than the version I might have wanted. That peace took time. I won't pretend otherwise. But Nanny was at peace from the moment she slid that folder across the table.